Do you know what? This is the closest I've ever got to a silent disco. And I learned all my dance moves from the Windows 95 launch, which will mean nothing to some of you. So, diversity in cybersecurity. I'm going to go through some things today about what's in it for you. And I just want to ask you some questions before I start. One, are you open to learning some of this stuff? And two, if I do bring something out that shows that there's something in it for you, will you take at least one action today? Fab. So I'm a big fan of neuroscience, as you can tell by my giant brain. The one on the screen, not this one. And I know that participation increases learning. So I'm going to ask you to do a few very un-British things. I'm going to ask you to nod vigorously, if you agree, or maybe stick your hands up occasionally. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do any whoops or jumping up and down like Tony Robinson, but this is in your interest. It will help move some things along in your mind. So I'll keep it British, but if you can do a little bit of that, that would be great. So, what is our primary goal or goals in cybersecurity? Anybody? What are we here for? You're being very British. What are we here for? Is it to keep attackers in or out? Out. Awesome, thank you. Is it to keep yourself safe or at risk? Safe, thank you. So there's a really current book that helps this by a guy called Sun Tzu. Has anybody heard of him? The book's called The Art of War. When I say current, it's 2,500 years old, but hey, it's still in print, and there's even a version of it for executives. And it's still also taught all the major military schools. So a quote from it, and I'm going to just read this out, is, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. And if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Okay, so what the heck does that mean? Because it's Chinese philosophy. It's very deep. It's very Confucius-like. So in short form, it means you need to understand your own capabilities. GDPR, actually, that process probably helped. But most importantly, if you want to defeat an attacker, you must first learn or think like an attacker. Would everybody agree that if you want to defeat an attacker, you've got to be able to think like an attacker? Thank you for the nods in the audience. I am autistic, it really helps me. So, what flavour do attackers come in? Are they all white middle-class men? No, they come in lots of different flavours, different racial backgrounds, different belief systems, different languages, different countries, different thinking types, genders. So, if they're not all the same, and we need to be able to think like them to defeat them, doesn't it stand to reason that we need diversity on our side? Great, so I've got a load of nods, my job is done, that's fantastic. Oh, how do we do diversity? Excuse me? So, how do we do diversity? Is that coming through your headsets? Is it finished now? Awesome. Okay, so we are more than statistics. Diversity is the strength you need to succeed. And if it's in our interest, because we're human, it's really easy to get behind certain diversities, isn't it? So I'm a woman, guess what? I'd like to see more women in cyber and in the boardroom, because I'm a woman. Because it gives me opportunities. But what about the guy in the middle? Now, before I cover a few things off, I would like to thank some people in the audience. I'd like to thank the middle-aged white guys, because there's a lot of you that are advocating for diversity at the moment. And thankfully, we have a skills shortage. So being an advocate for more women and more people of colour and more differences in sexuality doesn't mean that there's less space for you, which is fantastic. But what I'd like to thank you for is I know that for the majority of you, even if there was less space for you, you'd still do it. So I want to say thank you for that, because it's important. And secondly, I'd like to say that the term diversity often starts the wrong business conversation, because we start it on solving the diversity problem. Like we're helping people, like it's an underrepresentation thing and we just need to give women a hand up, or all the other groups, like it's a nice social exercise that makes us feel good. But we're not tokens to fill a quota, and we're not in need of assistance simply because we're fewer in number, and we're more than statistics. We are the strength that helps solve this problem. However, the statistics do show a really interesting picture. So here are some statistics. I'll start with the United Kingdom, because I like to start on my home turf, and it's nice to have a little good news. In the United Kingdom, for every 10% increase in gender diversity in the boardroom, EBIT, profit, rose by 3.5%. And investors are starting to take note of this and actually specifically look for gender diverse boardrooms. In the US, it's racial and ethnic diversity that is making the most impact, and it's significant. Companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So there's a lot of statistics. Is anybody finding that any of those a surprise? Anybody? So nobody's finding the first one a surprise. That's made up, by the way. The first one isn't true. Now, I'll tell you a little story about how it got there. I was prepping for a podcast, and I was really under time pressure. And my husband is an awesome guy, and he's really good at slide decks. And I'd done every bit of the slide deck, and I had all this research and facts from McKinsey, and I just needed those 3 little boxes doing. And I ran into his office, and I said, I've got to get to my podcast. Could you put these 3 little boxes together? And he said, as he often does, yeah, sure. It's like, thanks, love. I love you. Bye. Off to do my podcast. And while I was doing my podcast, it arrived on my desk, quickly opened the slides, looked at this one, and I went, great job, thanks, Ian, and sent it. And on the way home, he said, did you like that little joke I sent? I'm like, what? What little joke? He said, you know, the mock statistics I put in for you so that you could pick the right one. And I went, I've sent it to the organisers. Now, I kept that slide and I've put it in this deck as well. And I did it for a really good reason. I grew up at a time when the French were blockading ports and burning our sheep. So when I read this, that little bit of bias that I had, that, you know, the French people are all strikers and they're lazy, meant that I didn't question that statistic. And the fact that I'm speaking from a position of authority because I'm the expert in the room today has meant that many of you didn't question that statistic either. And on social media where fake news is prevalent, this is the sort of bias that creeps in when people say stuff that isn't true. And that's really important. I really, in some ways, you know, there are lots of biases I'm working on. The French, it's kind of lower down, to be honest, in my queue. But essentially, it made it believable. And that's important. So that kind of brings me on to the next slide. And you remember earlier on when I asked if you would take one action today. So, yeah, thank you for taking a picture. That's awesome. This is exactly the slide I'd like you to do that with. If you don't take a picture, that's cool. On CyberGoGiver, which is my Twitter feed, there is a link to this. I'm not going to ask you to do it right now, but if you do nothing else today, this is what I would like you to do. I would like you to go and take this bias test. And there is a really important reason why I would like you to take this bias test. And that is, we are programmed by society to react in certain ways to people. And we're also programmed by our primate brain. Has everybody heard of that kind of primate brain theory? You know, we're basically primates, we're chimps, we kind of think like this, and we like people that look like us and think like us and act like us, and that's normal. But it's a poor program. It's a legacy program. It's the Windows XP of programs. It shouldn't be in our brain box, but it is. And that legacy program does not serve us well in our goals of understanding attackers' minds. To use an investment example, if you had £1 million and you put it all on one horse, everybody would go, "You are nuts." Diversification is a key to successful investment, and your people are your greatest asset. So what should they be? Diverse. It helps us solve these problems. Now, would you say in cybersecurity that you cannot mitigate against your vulnerabilities unless you know what they are? Can you go and fix holes in your system if you don't know they exist? The majority of the time. Do you need to discover what those holes are? This is the way you do that for your human operating system. Because would everybody say in the room that they would like to be fair to a diverse candidate when they were coming for a job? Would everybody say, "I believe at heart that I would like to be fair"? How can you be fair if you don't know where your scale is? If you don't know what bias you have so you can mitigate against it? Would you all say that's a fair thing to say? So this test is the one thing I would love you to go and do. So, having said that, having said I like my own biases, I like women in the boardroom, I'd like to talk about another one that I'm very fond of. Neurodiversity. I mentioned earlier I like you nodding because I'm autistic and I don't recognize micro-expressions. One of the things that people often say is you want to think out of the box. Is that a common thing? I want to employ somebody that thinks out of the box. Well, guess what? We're hardwired to think differently to the majority of people. And neurodiversity includes autism spectrum condition, but it also includes, for those who are these things or have relatives of these things, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysnomia, a lot of other ADHD and OCD. So if you have anybody in your organization that has those things, it's worthwhile helping them be more successful by taking a bit of time to give them what they need to perform at their best, because it is easier to think outside of the box if you already live there. So what typical traits do neurodiverse people have that they can bring to your business? Well, one, a lot of neurodiverse people will have extreme hyperfocus. That's a challenge, but it's also a benefit. A lot of people that have any kind of diversity have had so many things that they've had to overcome. When they have somebody that believes in them and invests in them, they become incredibly loyal employees that are incredibly beneficial members of your team. And wouldn't we all like that? And they tend to have, and this would be shown on my next slide, incredible powers of pattern recognition and the ability to see things in a way that maybe nobody else has seen. So it's hard to say with historical figures. There are lots of current ones that are very visible. People like Richard Branson, who's dyslexic. But I wanted to go through some of the historical figures very briefly. Darwin, Tesla. So Tesla had a fixation with the number 13. He was incredibly sensitive to light. And if you've ever read a sort of a biography of his, he wasn't a loving man. He wasn't easy to get on with. He was difficult. And, you know, it can be a bit like that because we have different rule sets. So there's two languages going on, and it's worthwhile exploring that. And my favorite of all, because I'm not speaking German, is Alan Turing. And he was different in so many ways, but he was also a genius who brought us the ability to be free today. In terms of other diversities that I love, we wouldn't have potentially got to space without the African American code breakers, computers, and we possibly wouldn't have flight like we have were it not for this brilliant lady who was the mum of the Wright Brothers, who was actually the engineer that inspired them to make stuff. And I heartily recommend that you look her up, because their dad was a bishop who brought back a little model which inspired them, but their mum was the daughter of a wheelwright and actually helped them build the first models. So a lot of the diversity in our history is unrecorded, and that's sad. So, how to do the hard stuff? It's not rocket science, which is great, because thankfully we have people in the room who we are trying to support, and they're individuals. Do you like the same thing in music taste as your partner? Do you like the same stuff as your next door neighbor? Why on earth, when we're trying to help support people then, do we go read a document and say, this is what it says you need, I'm changing your light? Why do we do that? Why don't we just have a conversation with people? Isn't that what you would want for you? So tweaking the environment a little bit, is a relatively easy thing to do. Making the wrong behaviors a little bit harder is a relatively easy thing to do, and that over time changes stuff. I have a personal vision for diversity, and that is that it will become a bit more like Star Trek. So it will be okay to say the gay guy in the corner, or the black guy, or the autistic woman. And the reason it will be okay is all the other shitty labels that go with it won't be there anymore, because what you'll be looking at is what they bring to the room. But we're not there yet. So as well as taking the bias test, if you want to do a little bit more than that, and I suggest the bias test is the start point, then there are a few things that you can do. So is anybody a leader in the room? Is anybody responsible for sort of leadership in any way? You've got people you manage. Okay, the one that you may want to pick up is inclusive leadership, because it's little nudges. Inclusion Nudges is a great book to give to your HR team, because it's got lots of little practical advice tips. Insecurity by Jane Franklin, who is a great speaker, a personal friend, and a fabulous author, is for the ladies in the room, because it talks about the journey we have made. Diversify is for the statisticians who want to know what the government is looking at. And Driven by Difference is really the story of organizations and what difference it's made when they've done this stuff. So that's kind of a little guide as to what one you might want to pick up. I've got most of them here with me today if you want to look at that. I am on the board for NeuroCyber UK, so I'm specifically interested in neurodiversity, and I've got a lot of expertise on that if you want to ask me some specific questions. Obviously, I've got personal experience, and if I haven't got the answer, I can connect you with somebody who will have, and thank you so much, and please take that test.
Thanks very much, Nicola. Any questions from the floor,
headsets.
guys? Just raise a hand and we'll get a mic through to you. Any questions?
I have stunned you all to silence. Oh, no. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Is that a hand up? No. Okay. Thanks very much, Nicola.
Hi. You mentioned you're neurodiverse. How does that affect you when you're working in a company?
When I'm working in a company. So I am very fortunate that I'm a leader in our company. So I've worked on diversity quite a lot. I didn't find out I was neurodiverse till I was 46. So I lived my entire life not knowing what I was a Vulcan in a room full of humans. And that's what drove my passion for neuropsychology. I needed to learn the human operating system to survive in a room full of people I didn't understand. And that's a common experience, actually, for people that are neurodiverse, because quite often we have to do a lot more walking the neurotypical people. My experience is that quite often it's like somebody standing at the top of the stairs and there's somebody in a wheelchair at the bottom, and you go, well, if you could come 3/4 of the way up, I'll meet you halfway. And I'm really lucky that I have an amazing team. So here's a direct example. In our boardroom meetings, because I don't recognise micro-expressions, our chairman, who's an immensely fantastic person, does some of my recognition for me. So if I'm talking and there's agreement in the room but I'm not spotting it, he'll go, can I just interject? And he will say, so my belief is that, Ian, you're agreeing. And Ian will go, yes, I'm agreeing. And then I go, oh, fantastic, because I was carrying on talking because I was waiting for that point and I'd missed it. Other people in our organisation, I'm very sensitive to light and sound, so our team are very considerate of that. I'll put headphones on, but there are other people in our organisation that are autistic, so they have that option of, would you like to work with headphones? Some people don't want to necessarily do our company meetings if they're feeling particularly unsocial in terms of energy level that day, so they don't have to come to them and we'll brief them afterwards. They're not big things. They're no more accommodating than some of the things that we have to do legally for, say, covering maternity or paternity. So some of this stuff is really simple. Some of it is quite surprising. There is one story that I'll share because they've said I can. One of our autistic colleagues, and social rules can be a challenge. There was a birthday card that was going round. And there'd been a bit of banter. It was an all-guy team. It's not banter that happens now. This was in the past, you understand. And thinking, oh, dickhead, yeah. And because that was something that they'd sometimes said jokingly to each other, a bit of football banter, he put it on the front of the birthday card. And it was like a little house, and it was like, oh, dickhead, hope your house burns down. Happy birthday. And we had to send the card round again, and then we had to sort of take him aside and say, actually, here's a social rule that you didn't know. So, I've done that from the age of 16 because I didn't know I was autistic, so I've had to learn these social rules and test them. So that's great because it's made me quite good at marketing copy, because I know if you change that word, it has this impact because I've had to study it. But for some people, that stuff is so difficult that if you can imagine the anxiety level of going into business every morning and not knowing whether your colleagues will hate you by the afternoon because you said something that you said with all innocence because you didn't know a social rule. So having a really understanding colleague set and having a open environment where people can share, these are the challenges I face, so that people can support them, is really important. And thank you for that question.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Any more, very briefly? Okay. Thanks so much for that, Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you.